Okay, in this video we're going to continue our look at our Projects Billing tab, and this time we're looking at the Options screen. Don't be fooled by the name. Although this screen does have all your billing options for this project, this is really the heart of where you're going to do all of your billing at in ArchiOffice. This screen has many options, and we're going to go through them somewhat rapidly to give you a feel for all of them. So, the first, of course, is the invoice method. And there are several choices. You can do standard hourly invoicing, standard fixed fee, also known as a stipulated sum. If you do contract work with the United States government, you may need to use a DSE DPE invoice. So we do have that as well. A standard percent of construction invoice, or a standard unit cost based on square footage or square meters or square whatever unit of measurement you choose to use. We also have the ability to apply caps, and we touched on this briefly in our video on the budget screen. There are actually two levels of capping of invoices within ArchiOffice. One, which we touched on the budget screen, which will allow you to cap an hourly phase at the phase level. But in addition to that, you also have the ability to cap hourly invoicings at the project level as well. So if you have time and materials that project-wide are not allowed to exceed a certain value of money, you can do that. You can just simply check the box, put in the value, and then from that moment on, until you turn the option off again, any invoice that you generate that has hourly time and materials on it, it will bill normally until it reaches this cap. And then from that time on, any additional time and materials that you put on that invoice or future invoices will simply bill at zero. Then we get into the actual billing options. So to begin with, adjustment markup. As the name implies, this is where you can create adjustments and set your expense markup. So adjustments, just very briefly, there are a few options here, but by far the most common is the ability to adjust the total charges. So what this actually will do is it will inject a line at the bottom of your invoice just before your subtotal that will allow you to just put a single line item adjustment with a description and ratchet the value of the total invoice up or down. So if, for instance, you have perhaps you want to give your customer a discount for always paying promptly. We can very easily do that. Give ourselves a little description and say, well, how much do we want to adjust the invoice by? And this can be a positive or negative value. And it also can be just based on a flat value or based on a percentage of the total invoice. So just as a simple example, if we want to give the customer $100 off, just for being a good customer and always paying on time, we can do that. We would just simply adjust total charges and apply to total, or we could also apply to time or expense, but total by far the most common. This is just a single line item, bottom line adjustment. Expense markup can also be set here, and this is project-wide. So any project that you go into this screen and make this change, as soon as you make the change, as with many other options in ArchiOffice, the change is not retroactive. So this will only affect time and materials, or rather expenses, moving forward. Invoice extras. So this is, as the name implies, extras. So you can set it up so that when you create an invoice, draft specifically, you'll get a second window that will pop up that will include a statement. You can also set an option that will add a line item to the bottom of your invoice that will show how much money is in your retainer account. And if you're doing a percent of construction invoice, you can also add a box to the bottom of the invoice that will actually display your fee calculation to your customer. Interest. So this is where you set your terms for both the regular payment term of the invoice as well as the interest term that is used for determining late fees. And by default, the payment term, if blank, defaults to 30 days. The interest term, if blank, defaults to no late fees. But by and large, most people do use a 30-day term. So what will this actually do? This will control the due date on your invoice. Your due date will be this many days after your invoice date. And then your interest term will determine how many days after your due date. Then if invoices are still not paid, if they are more than this many plus this many days old, they are now considered late, and they start generating late interest. Or more specifically, the next invoice you make with these options set generates the late interest. And then of course you can also set the annual rate of how much that late fee is and whether or not it's going to be computed using compound interest. We can also set our tax rate, and we will have a separate video for tax rate in a future video, as this can be rather involved. But suffice it to say, the program has several different options. Standard single flat rate tax, as you might expect there to be. But there are also more specific options for those people in areas that have very complicated taxing requirements. Those options are available. So we can certainly set that, and then we have a convenient update button here, and this actually will retroactively update any existing time or expense entries to these new tax settings. Invoice format. As the name implies, this controls some aspects of the layout of the actual invoice. And basically there are two things here that are pertinent. The first is the grouping. So primarily you have the option to tell the program, well, how do you want me to primarily group all of the time and materials that are listed on this invoice? By and large, most common is by job code. If you have a relatively intelligently created list of job codes, this is a very convenient and easy way to group the codes in a meaningful manner. And then within each of these groups, whether you go with code or phase, or none, but whether you go with code or phase, you can then subgroup the items. And you can choose anything from just a straightforward itemized list, show me absolutely every time entry that is in that group, or you can say, no, there's a lot of time on this project, or maybe my customer just doesn't like to see their invoices that way. Just give me a simple summarized list, one line item per grouping, per employee, or per phase. Just a simple, straightforward, short, one-page invoice. Here's all my summarized numbers, and I'm done. I can also control whether or not I display the number of hours and the bill rate for each of these groupings, or whether I omit them. Perhaps the customer just doesn't care, or I have reasons that I don't want them to know the actual rate. I can do that. I also have the option to say, well, for this invoice, I don't want to bill time at all. I don't care if the time is in the valid date range I select for the invoice. I can actually turn that off and say, no, for this one, I only want to bill expenses. Or vice versa. I can bill only time and say, No, for this invoice, I need to do something special, no expenses. So you can actually turn those off. And much like time, expenses have some of the same options. I also have the option to show project balance or invoice total. Well, what does this really mean? What this really means is there are many things that can appear in the block of totals numbers at the bottom of the invoice. Subtotals, the bottom line total, the project balance, the account balance, retainer values, retainer payments, all kinds of stuff. Well, you might not necessarily need all that. I just need a simple invoice that has one bottom line total, none of this other stuff. The customer doesn't care about it, they don't need to know. You can do that. You can simply say, just show me the invoice total and that's it. Not a problem. Or vice versa. No, this customer, they need to see all that or they want to see all of that. So you can turn that on. And then finally is the invoice output. And this is where you can set not only the output format, whether it's just in our simple viewer window, or whether it automatically renders a PDF for you, which you can conveniently save to an offsite location if you choose to do that, or an RTF, a rich text format document. And this actually will open and be fully editable in Microsoft Word or any other program of that type, which can edit an RTF document. But in addition to the format, you can set a title, which will appear at the top of the invoice, centered just below all the basic header information. And then you can also enter a message. And this message can be virtually unlimited, up to and including an entire novel, which has been done for testing purposes. So you have a good amount of space here that you can put in a message if you choose to, and then decide whether you want that message to appear at the bottom of the invoice or at the top. And I should point out that this message is actually in addition to a secondary message which is defined in preferences, which I will briefly show you, which is actually found under Preferences, Billing, Labels, Category, Invoice, Header. And you'll see there is a predefined invoice message also, which by default is used to enter your Please Make Payments to line. So this message is actually in addition to that. So you do not have to duplicate that information here. And then finally, the format, or rather the actual invoice template format, which will be used to lay out the invoice. And the only actual difference between the standard type A and the standard type B invoice is the header information at the very top. Type A will be grouped in a block style format in the right hand side of the page, and type B will be arranged horizontally across the top of the page immediately below your logo. And then you can see here also, if you do have any custom templates made for you, if our standard templates don't fit your needs, we can craft a custom template for you that will do pretty much anything you need. So if you do have that, that will also be shown here. And then finally, to actually create an invoice, we will go to this lower action menu and just simply go to New, put in our date ranges to define what range of dates we want this invoice to look at in terms of what time and expenses to capture. And then the invoice date itself. So what date do we want the invoice to be considered as being created on? Now this is not the due date, mind you. This is the invoice date. The due date would be terms, days beyond that. And then our invoice number. And this will actually default from a sequentially running number in preferences. But you can override this. If you have a custom invoice number that you want to use for this particular invoice, you absolutely can do that. And you just continue, and it will make your invoice and you will see your draft. And then once the draft is created, you will find there will be additional options on this action menu to view that draft, or if you made a mistake, you can delete the draft, or if you review it and it looks good and you're ready to finalize it, there is an option for that as well. And once it is finalized, of course, it will appear on your invoices screen. And that is all the options on the options screen. And we will finish our look at the project billing screens in the next video, where we will cover performance.